Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibis, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here. It's Wednesday. Hope you're having a good one wherever you are. Before we get started, you know the drill. If you're on YouTube, don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Like the video, share it with your friends, and you can ring my bell if you want notifications of when I post new content. Click that little bell icon so you don't miss anything. Music fact of the day. If you've listened to me long enough, you know I've said if I could go back in time to one event where I couldn't change really terrible things from happening in the world and just do a selfish one, I'd go to Woodstock. Tens of thousands of vehicles were parked as far as 20 miles away from the site of the festival. Also, it took a decade for Woodstock organizers to turn a profit. The creators spent nearly $3.1 million in '69. That's equal to about $15 million in today's money, and they only took in $1.8 million. It wasn't until the early '80s they were able to pay off the loans and turn a profit. By the way, the police in that town in Bethel, New York, said that that was the most respectful group of young people they ever could have imagined. They anticipated lots of problems, and they really had none. The defense just rested, and they are going to closings. Now, that's a day early. Those weren't expected until tomorrow. Kind of curious if maybe Hannah thought she was going to take the stand and ultimately decided not to, and that's why they moved him up. I guess we'll never know. Curious to see how long deliberations take. Not sure if I'm going to get into a really in-depth closings episode. My youngest has her very first track meet tonight. She's running varsity for a local high school, but let me give you a little spoiler. The state's going to say it all fell on Hannah to make sure that safe was set with the use of firearms, convict her, and the defense, they're going to say not to. Curious to see how long deliberations are going to take. I don't think it's going to be super quick, but as soon as the verdict comes in, I will update you on probably a YouTube short. So hit that bell notification so you know. Let's jump into yesterday's testimony. It was wild, y'all. I didn't catch up until late last night, but it was a doozy. The first witness up yesterday was Lorenzo Montoya. He's a compliance officer for OSHA. He's a safety inspector and an accident investigator. He interviewed 17 people as part of his investigation, including Hannah, Dave Halls, Alec Baldwin, Sarah. They requested safety policies and their training policies from the production. They did provide safety bulletins for several different areas of the production. Witnesses also provided email and text messages to them. Ultimately, they concluded the management team, the chain of command, beginning at the lowest level and working up. That was Sarah, Gabrielle Pickle, Dave Halls. They were all responsible for a lot of failures that ultimately ended with the accident that killed Miss Hutchins and injured Joel Souza. In terms of who they identify as management and responsible parties, they did not find Hannah responsible for the shooting. The production company contested their findings, and ultimately, the production company was fined $100,000. It was a settlement. It's a very high fine by OSHA. He said, "We came to the conclusion Hannah was not afforded time to conduct her duties to the best of her diligence. The production had hired Hannah to perform multiple safety jobs for the production and then told her she was spending too much time on those tasks and directed her to do other duties. They also concluded Hannah had no authority to make any training decisions, and when she expressed concerns about not having enough time to adequately do her armoring job, that went unheard. Rust had no process or procedures to ensure no live rounds were brought in on that set. And in safety bulletin number 1, it said Hannah decided when training and retraining was necessary. They did not find Hannah tried to get more time for training, as the state has said all along. The Rust safety official on set was Dave Halls, and they found a lot of those policies that were in that first safety bulletin that were not adhered to, and ultimately would have fallen on him. We know he pled guilty to negligent use of a deadly weapon, got 6 months unsupervised probation, which has concluded. The root cause was Rust Productions had a hazard working with firearms and adopted a firearm safety policy, but didn't inform their employees, didn't train them, and nothing was done past the policy itself. Safety concerns were raised due to safety bulletin number 1 policies not being followed by cast and crew. On cross, they point out his investigation wasn't criminal. He didn't look at the sheriff's office report, didn't download the phone data from people, didn't view footage except for a clip that was actually in the media. They weren't made available to OSHA. They were told Hannah had 8 days as armorer. The state points out she had 10, and also On the day of the shooting, she had hours that morning to inspect the dummy rounds. They asked if Hannah contributed to some of the findings they made in her role as armorer. He doesn't agree. He said OSHA's opinion is management has to enable the work be done in the first place. Then he's asked if Hannah passed off a loaded gun as cold, would it be a workplace hazard? He says yes. On redirect, they talk about the state presented the hypothetical if Hannah passed off a loaded gun as cold, it would be a workplace hazard. But what if Rust had not allowed the armorer sufficient time to inspect the gun and they rushed her? Whose fault would it be then? He said it's the supervisor's place to double check that. That would have been Dave Hall's. They also talk about the fact that Gabrielle Pickle said there were no more armorer days out of those 8 that she had, and no more training days were to occur. He's asked if there were other communications between Hannah and Gabrielle Pickle that supported Rust was at fault and not Hannah. He said there was a text and email conversation he reviewed regarding Hannah being told that the armorer days are done, and there were other communications about firearms being left unattended, and it's on them to do something about these guns being left around, but there was no response. So ultimately, they just concluded Hannah wasn't at fault. It was a problem much bigger than hers. They did have another person from OSHA on. His name was Robert Genoway. He essentially confirmed everything the first witness said. It wasn't anything really new with his testimony. The next witness, Scott Elliott, he's a private investigator, former homicide detective. He physically looked at evidence and interviewed a majority of the state's witnesses except the FBI witnesses. He conducted about 30 to 40 interviews. He felt the officers' responses were not what they should be when they arrived on scene. You narrow it down to who was in the church or just outside, and there were maybe 20 people. Once witnesses to the shooting were identified, they should have been separated and cell phones secured. He also notes Baldwin was not segregated and his cell phone was not taken. They point out somebody left the scene. The day of the shooting has not been identified. He finds fault with someone being asked to go get the prop cart. He said this person went out of sight to get it, and that should have never happened. As far as the evidence on that prop cart, he notes that the responding deputy took an ungloved hand and grabbed that gun by the cylinder, put it in his car, took it out of his car and back on that prop cart. Same with the ammo boxes. He saw no attempt to look and see if the rounds Sarah threw away were still in the trash. Even a month later, when law enforcement was made aware of this, nobody attempted to go back and see if they were there. There was no backtracking of where the live ammunition came from. He said they should have interviewed the maker of the ammunition. And this is kind of weird. I'm not sure if he just got a little mixed up here, but he said law enforcement was told this is the firearm used, but the projectile couldn't be matched to a firearm. He said, I know there were 3 .45 long Colt revolvers on the prop cart that day. And although the casing has been tested to match the firearm, there's no way to know that projectile positively came from that firearm. He said it wasn't a whodunit, it was a why and a how. They talk about PDQ warehouse not having that search warrant executed for a month after the shooting, and you can do anything in a month. Seth was identified almost immediately as being a supplier, and he thinks there should have been a full investigation into Seth. He points out the contact with Sarah almost immediately after the shooting. That in itself warranted his phone being seized. He points out that Seth and Sarah had about a dozen calls between the two of them, and then Baldwin left the state with his phone. The extraction was done in New York. That should have been taken immediately after he was identified as the shooter. When the lieutenant first arrived on scene, the first 2 things he asked for was the gun and the armorer. The witness points out that the lieutenant didn't seem concerned about who was the shooter and the status of that shooter. Hannah was not free to leave the area. If the lieutenant walked away, he had someone stay with her when she was sitting in that cop car. Everyone else on set, including the shooter, was allowed to do what they wanted. He mentions that when Detective Hancock arrived on scene, she took over watching Hannah. The defense talks about people being interviewed during traumatic situations. He said the first thing that he would have done would have been to have EMS check Hannah. He said you have to be extra careful that their mental state in that moment doesn't come back later to hinder your investigation. On cross, it's your job to aid in Hannah's defense. And of course it is. He's hired. You take issue with law enforcement touching the gun with his bare hands. But unlike homicide, this occurred in the presence of a dozen people or more, so there was no mystery as to who had the gun and who pulled the trigger. Then she goes into this statement about the projectile and the gun and asks if he's heard something the jury hasn't heard when he said the projectile can't be positively identified as coming from the Baldwin firearm. He said only in the instance the firearm was presented to law enforcement, it doesn't change the outcome. The prosecution asked, where's the controversy? He said when the officers arrived on scene, that's what they were told. The prosecutor said that that projectile went through 2 human beings and there wasn't enough markings due to the damage. He said that that's true. The state points out, Hannah said to the lieutenant, this is the box I was pulling from, the one that was put in his patrol unit. She asked where was the controversy as to where the ammo was being pulled from, and then asked if in her second interview, did you see that Hannah pulled up a photo, again saying, this is my box, and it was the same box that she said that day she had been pulling from. The prosecution asked what was his concern about the gun. Should there have been more follow-up at the time? He said Hannah didn't hand the gun to Baldwin, so there should have been more investigation at that time. She asked if he agrees now there's no issue. That was the gun that fired the round, and he said yes. Y'all, this witness, if you're watching on YouTube, watch this video. Frank Lewis Blair Kuski III, firearms expert, says he's been shooting from almost birth. Detective Bowles tells him before they bring these firearms out to make sure to remove the cylinder and see if they're unloaded. Well, he didn't. He whipped his gun out like Billy the Kid on that stand, y'all. He's pointed at the ceiling. There's an objection by the state. They go to sidebar. The judge says to him, first of all, everybody's nervous because you have not demonstrated to us that they're unloaded. So before you start showing us the weapons, make sure they're unloaded, including that one you just touched. So he goes to do it, totally points the gun at the judge. The bailiff lowers that gun down. You can't make this stuff up, y'all. This is a trial about a firearm going off with a live bullet inside, all about gun safety. He showed the jury a Denix gun, which is a gun that can't fire. The second was a replica of Baldwin's gun. At this point, he pointed the gun back towards the camera that was recording the trial and took out the cylinder. He explained the safety on the gun to the jury. On cross, the state said, do you agree with me that basically gun safety requires the handler of the gun not point the gun at anyone? He said, if it's a real gun, yes. The state says, do you agree with me while you're sitting here in the courtroom, you pulled out a gun and you pointed it at the judge? And he says, I do not. She says, you disagree? He said, I pointed the gun in this space up here. He was waving his hands in the air, y'all. Never directly at the judge. The state says, do you agree that basic gun safety requires that you keep the muzzle of the gun pointed down for safety? He said, not at all. He said a gun may be pointed up, pointed back, cross arms, maybe pointed at the ground. So no. The last witness today, very quick witness before the defense rested. It was filmmaker PJ Pesh. He's a veteran of writing and producing movies over 30 years. And basically his testimony was if a firearm is on set, the armorer should be called to be on set with that firearm. He mentions too, there is a phone number you can call if you're working on a set and you feel unsafe, but it's kind of taboo and you might lose your job if you do it. So really, what's the point? So we will look and see what happens at closings today. If there's any huge points made that we haven't heard already, I'll cover it, but won't be long. We'll be on verdict watch and we'll see what happens next. I'm very curious to see what's going to come of this. I think I'm 50-50 of whether or not these jurors are going to find her guilty. I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion back in that deliberation room, but we'll bring it to you when it happens. You guys have a good rest of your day. We'll see you soon.